actually knew Malcolm X. Can you tell us how that came about?
Oh yeah, I had been following the black media when very few people paid attention. When I got into the 40s and the 50s, I wanted to know about everything in the whole world. So I was looking at, for most people, strange places. And I regularly read the Amsterdam News, which was the main newspaper for black Americans in those days. And that's where I picked up on Malcolm X. I saw articles by him and about him, and I was intrigued by the guy because he was something totally different. And I wanted very much to meet him and interview him. And I had a black journalist who was a friend of mine, and I told him, I said, you know, I'd love to get together with Malcolm X. Do you have a phone number you can give me where I can give him a call or call his office? And he said he's not going to want to talk to you. And this was when he was in his devil stage for the white man. And I said, well, you know, I'd like to take a chance. He said, look, I'll give you the number if you swear that you'll never tell anybody ever that where you got it. And I said, yep, you got a promise. And he gave me his number, and I called him up. And I was in Queens at the time, and he was in Harlem. And there's a river between us, and probably 20 miles or more between us. And he didn't know who I was. And that's kind of important in telling the story because I called that number, and he answered the phone. And we had the most incredible non-conversation. I told him who I was and that I'd like to interview him, and he hardly said anything. Very polite, very soft-spoken, no problems, but nothing happened. I said, well, you know, I'd love to interview you, and he said, well, I don't think we could do that. And then I said, well, maybe I can ask you some questions on the phone. And he hardly ever said anything, you know, yeah. And I started asking questions, and of course he didn't answer any of them. And after a few minutes, I thought, well, this is hopeless. And I said, well, it looks like we're not going to have an interview. And he said, yeah, I guess so. And I said, well, you know, I'm just doing my job. And he said, I'm sure you are, which meant that he was intimating very strongly I was an FBI agent or something. And so we kind of did that, and there was more and more silence. And finally I said, well, goodbye. And he said, goodbye. And up until that point, he had the softest, it was like velvet, very polite. And I can't duplicate what he said. It would be impossible, but I'll give it my best shot. He said, well, goodbye, Mr. Lucifer. And I have never heard so much hate in my life in a voice. It was just brutal. Uh, my wife was sitting across the living room from me, and she said, what's the matter? And I said, what do you mean? She said, you're white as a sheet. And I looked down my arms, and I had goosebumps all both arms with goosebumps. He was that frightening because the hatred that he had for white people just, I mean, it hit you right between the eyes. And I tracked him for years. Didn't make any more tries to get together with him. But I tracked him. I kept all kinds of sources that I had to see what the guy was doing. I was fascinated by him. And then he defected, and he left Elijah Muhammad and the black Muslims, and I was able to reconnect with him. He was having a press conference, and a friend of mine that was the editor for U.S. News and World Report said, hey, Charlie, your buddy, because he knew I was tracking Malcolm. He said he's having a press conference. So I rushed in from Queens and got there in time. And I waited until the conference was over. Everybody asked their questions. and it was just he and I left. And I went over to him and I started talking about things that he had been involved with. And he was stunned by the fact that I knew all this stuff because he didn't find any white guys that knew those things. And so as a result of that, we kind of became friendly. And this time he gave me his phone number. I had a lot of very fascinating phone conferences with him. And I say conference because they lasted. We would talk, and unfortunately in those days you had a cord that long that tied you to the wall if you had that kind of phone. And I had a phone like that in the kitchen, and I would crock that son of a gun under between my shoulder and my chin, and while I did dishes or I did something else, and we talked, a half an hour, 45 minutes, and we talked about everything. I don't know why he thought that was okay to talk to me that much, but he did, and we talked about everything. And some of the things we talked about, would surprise the hell out of people. For example, he said, "I don't vote because I'm not an American." And he explained that in detail, that, he thought that the way black people came here, that they really weren't part of the country, and he did not consider himself an American. So he said, well, I wouldn't vote. He said, but if I was going to vote in the next election, this was in, I guess, 63, he said, if I was going to vote, I'd vote for Barry Goldwater. And that kind of stunned me a little bit, because he, of course, was the most conservative guy that ever ran, I guess, at that time. And I said, oh, you'd vote for Barry? Yes, he said, that's what my people need. He said, Barry Goldwater tells the truth. He said, Barry Goldwater says exactly what he is prepared to give to the black population and what he's not going to give. And it's an honest assessment. And he said the liberals, they keep telling him about all the good things they're going to do for him, and of course they never do them. And he said, and they need to hear Goldwater, so we now know where we stand and what we have to do. And it was an insight. I'm sure that none of the biographers even hint at the fact that he would support Barry Goldwater. And he said other things. For example, when all the civil rights leaders were saying that if they didn't pass the civil rights bill, that there'd be rioting on the streets. I mean, that you heard that refrain over and over. He told me the absolute opposite. He said, if they pass the civil rights bill, there will be riots. And of course, he was right. They passed the civil rights bill, and shortly thereafter, we had the riots all over the place. And I would say that he is not just one of the smartest men that I've ever known, but he is in there with the very, very, very top people. I might even put him up there with the smartest of the bears. In other words, Dr. Edward Teller, of all the people I've ever known, was the smartest man. And Malcolm X is somewhere up in that category of being super smart. And there was just, he was a fascinating guy, and they killed him. I had a meeting with him a few days before the expiration of the threat. He was threatened. The word was out in the community that he would be dead within 30 days. And I had lunch with him, I think about 7 days before the end of the 30. And my wife at that time insisted that she go with me. We had quite an argument about it, actually, because, this guy was marked for assassination. I didn't want to bring my wife into that. But she said, of all the people that I ever dealt with, he was the most fascinating. And she said, and I want a chance to meet him. So the two of us went to a diner between the white and the black district in Jackson Heights in Queens. And that was my last meeting with him. And what a shame that we lost him, because he could have meant so much to us. And I guess my wife Tina put it in the best way I've ever heard. She said, as we were watching the funeral on TV, she said it's like watching the last copy of a great novel being burned. And as you're watching it burn, you never got around to reading the last chapter to know how it all ended. And she said, when I'm looking at this funeral, that's what I'm thinking. We never got to the last chapter, and now the book's gone.